In normal conversation, the gap between one person stopping and the next person speaking is often only 0 to 200 milliseconds. Planning a single word takes roughly 600 milliseconds. Planning a simple sentence takes about 1500. The silence after the speaker stops is nowhere near long enough to build the answer that comes next. Your reply usually has to begin forming while the other person is still talking. From the outside, this looks like listening followed by answering. Inside, the two processes are already overlapping. If the answer starts loading while the meaning is still arriving, what happens to the unfinished part of the message? Keeping your mouth closed does not mean your attention is still with the speaker. While the sentence continues, you may already be building a reply, retrieving a similar story, preparing advice, forming an objection, or predicting the ending. None of this requires a decision to stop caring. It happens because the brain is trying to stay ready. You can hear every word and still spend most of the message waiting for the moment when it becomes your turn. Hearing the sounds, holding back speech, and receiving the speaker's intended meaning are three different jobs. Talking can be difficult too. The mystery is that listening looks inactive while much of its work remains hidden. Therefore, before we ask why listening fails, we need a better test than whether the listener stayed quiet. Real listening requires three things to stay active at once: attention, understanding, and a stance toward the person speaking. Attention keeps the moving sentence in view instead of letting the reply take over. Understanding connects the words into the meaning the speaker is still building. The relational part asks a different question. What does this mean from their position, not merely from yours? That is why attentive, empathic, non-judgmental listening is more than good manners arranged around silence. You can maintain perfectly respectable eye contact while privately rehearsing the sentence you plan to say next. The face looks present. The processing may already be somewhere else. But conversation does not wait for all three parts to finish before it demands an answer. To answer on time, the listener does not wait for the turn to end. They estimate where it is going. Context, speech rhythm, grammar, and visible gestures help predict both what comes next and when the speaker will stop. Prediction is necessary. Without it, ordinary conversation would pause noticeably after almost every turn. Estimating the endpoint is not the same as composing a full answer, although the two can begin to overlap. In one EEG study, the fastest responders showed weaker anticipatory processing of the part of the question that was still coming. That does not mean every quick reply reflects poor listening. Speed can also communicate attention and synchrony. The result suggests a narrower trade-off. Committing early may leave less processing available for the unfinished question. Prediction gets the reply ready at the right moment, but readiness alone does not explain where the missing attention goes. Once a possible answer becomes an active task, the listener is no longer only processing the speaker's words. Selecting language, arranging a sentence, preparing advice, or building a defense all require capacity of their own. Those demands overlap with the unfinished message, and both cannot always receive full processing at the same time. Across 4 experiments, detecting phonemes in incoming speech became harder after listeners began planning their answer. When processing capacity became scarce, speech planning received priority. The system can protect the response it is building while basic processing of the remaining speech becomes weaker. No deliberate decision is required. The listener can appear engaged and still fail to register the final detail. The reply may sound fluent precisely because the machinery producing it received the resources it needed. Fluency proves that an answer was prepared. It does not prove that the whole message arrived. This is how someone can respond perfectly well to the general point while missing the one detail that changed what the speaker meant. But even without a consciously rehearsed reply, spoken information remains fragile because it keeps moving after attention slips. When your eyes drift during reading, the words stay on the page, and you can pause, return, or notice that nothing has been absorbed. Speech offers no such courtesy. The sentence keeps advancing while your attention is somewhere else. In 2 laboratory samples, participants reported mind-wandering during 50.6% of listening probes, compared with 35.6% during silent reading. Listening also produced the poorest memory scores. The difference does not prove that reading is always better, but it exposes the disadvantage of a message that disappears as it arrives. A brief lapse may cost one phrase, several sentences, or the connection between them, without creating a clear moment when the loss becomes obvious. Then attention returns and the speaker is still talking, so the listener quietly continues from whatever part remains. The words arrived, they simply did not stay. Even when every word survives, The listener still has to decide what those words refer to from the speaker's point of view. In a classic 2000 experiment, listeners followed instructions about objects arranged so that one item was visible to them but hidden from the speaker. Their attention was initially drawn toward the object only they could see. Then they had to correct that interpretation and choose the option the speaker could actually have meant. The words were heard correctly. The delay came from beginning with private knowledge and adjusting afterward. Your own perspective is immediately available, while someone else's situation has to be reconstructed. That is how remembered sentences can produce confident advice, assumptions, or explanations that answer your version of the problem instead of theirs. The listener is not necessarily disregarding the speaker. The first interpretation simply arrived from the wrong viewpoint, but what happens when that correction must compete with emotion, identity, and the need to participate? Real conversation adds more competitors than a laboratory task ever needs. One familiar word can trigger a personal memory, an objection, a solution, a joke, a defense, or an opportunity to sound useful. Each reaction is understandable, and none requires the listener to stop caring. The trouble begins when the unfinished message becomes raw material for whatever the listener wants to do next. A complaint becomes a problem to solve, a confession becomes a similar story, and a disagreement becomes a case to defend. Meanwhile, the speaker's actual meaning is still arriving. The internal microphone is crowded before the external one has even changed hands. Bad listening often comes from too many eager processes trying to participate, not from one cold decision to ignore someone. That explains the failure. Without removing agency, the listener can still decide which reaction gets promoted into speech. But it also raises a harder question. Does high-quality listening reliably improve the conversation, or have we simply turned silence into a virtue? High-quality listening can change a conversation, but the supported effect is smaller and more specific than good listeners fix everything. Across 5 experiments involving 1,643 participants, people who felt listened to after discussing social rejection reported less immediate loneliness. Part of that reduction was linked to greater feelings of connection and autonomy, the sense that someone was with them without taking control of the experience. That is a real social effect, but it is not a promise of lasting recovery, perfect understanding, or repaired relationships. Researchers usually describe good listening as attentive, empathic, and non-judgmental, not simply quiet, slow, agreeable, or full of questions. A fast response can signal attention and synchrony, while a slower one can signal reflection. Neither speed proves that the meaning was received. Talking less is not a reliable shortcut either, and in some controlled conversations, people who spoke more were actually liked more. Other studies have found limits. Listening does not reliably remove anxiety, create authenticity, or make persuasion succeed. Therefore, once the easy rules disappear, the practical question is smaller. Which internal reaction deserves to enter the conversation immediately? The 0 to 200 millisecond gap between turns is not where the reply begins. It is where earlier internal work becomes visible. Prediction, memory, advice, defense, and self-presentation may already be active before the speaker reaches the final word. Real listening does not require eliminating those reactions. It requires keeping them from replacing the meaning that is still arriving. The useful pause is not necessarily longer or more dramatic. It may be only enough restraint to avoid promoting the first reaction into speech. Before answering, there's one honest test. Could you accurately continue the speaker's point or clarify what they meant? If you cannot, the reply may be ready while the understanding is not. The opening gap was never empty silence. It was the final edge of a competition already happening underneath. Better listening begins when the meaning is allowed to arrive before the reply takes its place.